Hello again, and welcome back to the Warcraft Workshop, the podcast that aims to make you a better player at World of Warcraft. My name is Preheat. I'm joined today by my co-host, Jedith.
Hello.
And we have a very special guest today. So today we are going to be talking to Liquid Telegon. He is a Liquid coach, also runs a guild called Velocity. Telegon, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, that's most of it. I'm an analyst for Liquid since Sepulcher, and then for one tier before that, I was an analyst for Method, and then I started Velocity after this Christmas, basically, as like a new project and just get deeper into the game.
So you also, I want to just expand on that. So Velocity is a guild that was formed when?
I don't know. It was like maybe 2 months ago. I don't actually remember the date.
Okay, so just for reference, I'm rating this guild, and it's like a solid rating guild. So we want to kind of pick your brain a little bit about the challenges to starting a new guild, and maybe tips that you might have for people who are either joining the guild or looking to start things up. So for starters, what is the biggest challenge that you kind of faced whenever you were starting a new guild, and what steps were most important to take early on?
Yeah, so it was a bit different for me than most people, I think.
Right.
And so I can talk a bit about like what I did and what I think matters. But at the end of the day, unless you have like, I think like 10 players that you can like start your guild like with, I think it's going to be like exceedingly difficult to create create a guild that can like clear mythic quickly.
Right.
So I think like if you're going to start a guild like from like relative scratch, right? Like you probably have to start in like the AOTC level and then like work your way up to like a mythic roster.
Right.
And obviously that's just gonna take a lot of time.
So the biggest tip you have is find a guild already.
Yeah, so I get expanded on my situation a little bit. Was
sure, yeah.
I was playing with a guild called Atlantic, just because just like as an analyst coach thing, it's like pretty detrimental to your ability, in my opinion, and your like quality perception to not be playing the game.
Yeah.
So that was like something I wanted to pursue, and I'd gone back and forth between like not playing, and then playing, and I decided like playing was better.
Yeah.
So that's why I was kind of in Atlantic, and then I helped them through their prog, and I started like using a lot more of the techniques that like I kind of pioneered with like VOD review, like from pull to pull, which is like a thing that I don't think a lot of people do. And if you watch like the Race of the World first, it's like kind of like endemic to our process, or if you watch Echo, like they do the same thing where like you have a wipe and then like Scripe or Max like pulls up like a clip of like what just happened, right? And then they're talking about it in real time. And that's like an obviously really strong process, and that really helped that guild through their frac progress, and they kill it pretty well in like 250 pulls, and it wasn't like it was before the seed nerf, so that was pretty good. I was like it's like World 190, and then after that, like fair like about 10 of the players in that guild kind of latched on to the like higher level like thinking and stuff that I like would talk with them about. I'd like show them a glimpse of like what higher level play and like discussion and stuff like that look like. And eventually there was some drama in that guild at the end. Like we parted ways, and then basically a lot of players like asked me like what I was going to do next, because that guild had kind of died, and enough of them were interested in like doing something with me that I thought that there was enough like support to just like start my own thing. And then the really important thing during that process was like nailing down the identity
and the culture as well, I'm sure.
Yeah, the identity of and the culture of the guild, because that is usually what kills most guilds, is like this friction between like people's goals and what they want and how they want to play the game. So it was really important that we have this like really concrete identity, and that when we put out like we were trying to start this guild, this is who we have so far, and this is like who we are, right, and like where we're looking to go and who we're looking to be. Like, does that resonate with you? And that was kind of like the whole tone of our messaging when like I made that tweet that was like advertising that we were recruiting, trying to like put this together as like a project.
Yeah.
And then obviously got a lot of support from Max and some of the other Liquid people on Twitter, and that reach like was definitely like more than I would have had otherwise by like many factors. I'm not really sure if
I mean,
could have
that's
just
how I
jumped
joined.
into it without that stuff. Yeah.
I saw the tweet, so I was like, oh yeah, you know what? Maybe I should go back in A for War Within. So this will be a fun little thing to do. So yeah, the reach definitely worked. It's you know, I think it's really important what you said about the expectations, because I've been in a couple guilds after doing World First Rating where the expectations that were set weren't necessarily, I don't think it was like meant to be like in some way like secretly they were nefariously planning to do something else. It just kind of like evolved that way because the players just, you know, half of the people wanted something more, half the people wanted to keep it the way it was. And I feel like I've seen this cycle happen so many times in guilds I've been in where they're not quite at like the high end, but they're pretty close, and they think, oh, we should just add a couple days. We should just add some hours. We should add more alts. We should do more splits. We should do this. We should do that. And then suddenly it like balloons into this thing where you're doing all the things, like you're going too hard, and then people just burn out instantly and the guild dies. I've literally seen it happen to like 2 different guilds where it's like the expectations weren't necessarily communicated well. And I feel like the way people get really upset or the way people quit the game is their expectations aren't quite what is happening in reality, and there's a difference there, and that's causing them to have conflict. And usually that kind of tears guilds apart, I feel like.
So, it's all about the friction, right? Like anything you do or like try and push within a guild is going to cause friction, and there's like a spectrum of friction from like high to low, right? And you generally want to keep everything on the low end, and the way that I think that is done is by making sure that the people who are in your guild are as closely aligned as possible and like on the same page with like the identity of the group that you want to create and like what your goals are and stuff like that and how you want to get there.
Yeah, communication.
I've seen the exact same thing, right? With so many NA guilds where I mean everyone just wants better rank, right? Well, how do we get the better rank? Well, we add more hours and we don't do anything else, right? Like BDG is a really good example of like, oh, we're just gonna hop into the race for first, and it was like super quick, and they just like slammed it, right? And that made that really hard on them, I think, in the long run. And that like style of like overcommitment really cascades, because you have people who are super passionate about the game who like really want the rank or want to kill the boss, right? And they don't care about whatever sacrifice in real life if maybe they don't even have one, right? So that they're just there. And then if someone else doesn't want to do that, right, or it feels bad about it, or like anything like that or like starts to build resentment, right?
Yeah.
And then then there's friction between those two players, right? And or two groups of players within your guild, and then that's when it can easily like just break apart and die.
It seems like getting the right roster is the most important thing, because that sort of disconnect between expectations, it's not just like a high-end thing too. Like I've kind of been working my way up over the past, like, I don't know, 5 years. And, you know, back in BFA, I was even in like some more casual guilds doing like AOTC stuff. And even then, there's like such a large disconnect, especially when you're trying to recruit. You know, you might try to recruit people and they come in expecting like, oh yeah, we're going to kill mythic bosses. And then once they get into the guild, they realize that like the majority of the roster is just like, you know, not really doing research into fights and whatever. And that disconnect, I feel like it's always there, just in no matter what, you know, difficulty of raiding you're doing. Is that something that you're able to sort of like see through when you're recruiting? Do you have like, because you put out your post to recruit for this guild. And to me, it seems like a lot of people would just be like, oh yeah, this sounds sick, I want to do this. But in reality, they don't really understand like what it entails and what is expected of them. Do you have ways that you can kind of like find out if they're really, you know, able to commit?
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. So specifically with like our interview process, which is something that has become more refined. We actually had to interview like a ton of people for Velocity, because
do you know how many people you interviewed?
I think it was like 50 or 60.
Oh, wow.
So that was a lot. But so the main thing that I looked for, I guess there's a tier thing. So first thing is like is it, are you like, does it feel like you're gonna vibe and like fit in with like the identity and like how we conceptualize ourselves, which really comes down to the
It's
low
like the
hour,
communication.
high effort
Yeah.
like standard, right? Where it's like, what I want from the game is to experience raid content, but in the most efficient and team oriented way possible, right? So if you're kind of vibing with that like core and fundamental idea, that's like step one. And then the step two is like how much thinking is going on behind the scenes. So we ask a lot of questions about like how people, like what people's thought processes are behind approaching fights when it comes to like how they're thinking about their defensive usage and justifying those usages, and when they're like hard assigning versus soft assigning things. That's like one of the biggest like immediate differentiators between like how much a player, like how cognizant a player is and about, and how much they should be thinking like during progress and before like you ever see a fight in the first place. Just like as a snap question. And then there's obviously like a lot more we can go into, but I try and keep it down to like 1 to 3 like more involved questions, and depending on how they answer those questions, that's kind of leads the rest of it. So it's not as time intensive as it could otherwise be.
So you're saying there's like some filter questions, I guess. Well, not necessarily filter questions, but it's like you get a pretty good indication just from a couple of questions that can lead you to the next couple.
Yeah, I mean, just think about it. Like, this was one of our main questions. Like, how do you like what do you think about using your defensives in phase 1 of Frac? Like, how did you approach that both before and then as you're progressing the fight? If they're like, I don't know, I just press it when I'm in danger or when I think I'm gonna die. That's like a good direction, you know.
There's a lot of guilds where they will spoon feed you that sort of information, right? Like you show up and they're like, all right, here's your timings. You have your ERT note, press your defensives here. And that's fine. Like it makes sense to do that for certain cases. But I feel like it's also important as a DPS player to just like look at a log and see like when the damage is happening, because that's pretty good indication to you like when you should probably think about either having a defensive or having the question asked about, is there a healer ramping here? Like, is there some sort of raid DR going out, right? Because like most of these bosses, at least this tier, there's like really, really big critical lineups of mechanics where everything kind of just like queues together. And that I feel like that, or like a single mechanic that does a shit ton of damage, it's like those are where you really have to think about it and make sure you have something.
It's just really like the player that makes the difference in a guild like Pescaris, right, which is like the most efficient guild in the world currently, right? Is like the player who can think for themselves and like problem solve without me holding their hand, right? Because I just don't have the time to give you an ERT note for your defensives or like look into like how you should be playing your class and stuff like that. I have I like there's a lot of time that needs to be spent in other preparation and other stuff.
Yeah, so talking me or mentioning that the other preparation. So like if you're going in to a fight, like what sort of steps are you taking to get it going? I'm assuming you're like watching videos and looking at logs, right? That seems like the obvious answer, but like could you give me a little bit more of the step by step?
Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff that comes up when you are part of a guild that's like progressing that isn't super accessible from a VOD. And there's a lot of skill in watching a VOD and being able to discern the really small bits that matter a lot, and making sure that you're like implementing those things that like aren't super obvious. And you can really see that as you like go down the guild ranks, right? Using like an extreme example from like Race World Last, it's like there's so many VODs and then there's so much content going very deeply into like how best to progress for AC, right? And yet you see like almost no strategy at all, right? When it comes to like diff parts of the fight that matter a lot, right? Taking stuff that I kind of like learned from for like quote unquote free from the Race World first is like really like a good bit beneficial. And then after that, it's really just digging into the law, like not the logs, but the VODs, and trying to catch all those like tiny things from different players' POVs that really matter and make a difference. And then it's also adapting. Like maybe we don't have the exact comp, right? So then maybe you're thinking about how do you have to adapt that strategy to fit into like the comp that you need to run, or if you need to solve like a comp based problem in another way by like getting someone in on a certain spec or something like that. But after that, it really comes to playing like getting in the fight and then having the ability to solve the problems in real time, right? Like either using like instant VOD review to take the like 5 minutes after a pull where something needs to be fixed and actually be able to fix it.
That's been really useful for my guild on Mythic Farak. Is having, I don't know what we use, but we have something that has like, you can insert different streams into it and you can just kind of flip between them to see different people's perspectives on the last pull. You can see like, okay, this ad didn't get CC'd, or that, that one ad got hit by a line and that's what caused us to wipe. And having those different perspectives to just be able to switch through and see exactly what happened has been super, super useful.
Yeah, I think Raid Plan has that function.
I think that's what it is, yeah.
Raid Plan. Yeah. It's a very obvious thing if you've progressed with a guild that just doesn't do that at all, or does like no kind of review, and they just like show up the next day and they pull again until like they figure it out. Yeah. Versus like a guild that's doing. So there's obviously like different types of mistakes, right? Where like some you don't look at the VOD and figure it out, but some the ones that like matter a lot, it's like night and day. Being able to like solve those problems and not have them happen over and over again.
Yeah, I think a good example of one of these little things that you could get from a VOD but wouldn't necessarily be abundantly obvious is like baiting the frontals, the mythic mechanic on Farak, right? Like the people who are trying to bait those out, because whenever you're watching a VOD of people killing like a in boss, usually it looks a lot easier than it actually is because everyone's kind of got the right plan, everyone's doing their jobs, right? But it isn't immediately obvious.
On Frack, really, I think. It was a very difficult boss, and it had a bunch of like small things that ended up mattering a lot. Something that was kind of like not super relevant outside of the race of first, but because you could have kind of like gathered this beforehand, but as an example of like something that would be very impactful to your progress time, is like if after every time you have a wipe in phase 3, if you have the POV of the person that like blew up a seed, there's like infinite, not infinite, but like an incredible amount of learning that can be done by watching some of those things, because you can kind of tell people like a bunch of micro to make the seed handling more consistent, but until they see it, it's hard to trust like that the line is like very, very small and that they should be handling it in a certain way. Because I like the intuitive thing from just watching a lot of people play the seeds is like whenever they drop it, they just move as far away as possible, right? Because like for whatever reason, and having that VOD where you can like talk about that like in the background or like before you get to that wipe again, and you have this like the shared learning experience of everyone there, like just incredibly valuable. And then at the same time you have this like really common thing in WoW, where there's like incredible recency bias where people like really trust their immediate memory of what just happened in that poll, like the whole poll, like no matter how long it was. And it is not often the case that they remember exactly what happened for whatever reason. Like people are not often like super correct when like an orb goes into fract, like exactly who missed it or like what happened with like a dream rend or a seed and stuff like that. The VOD really comes in handy with like combating that.
Sometimes that's just denial sometimes, but yeah, definitely, because it's hard to tell when you're in the moment, right? Like you have your own perspective and you're looking at a certain direction and you might not see exactly what's happening.
Human memory isn't like perfect, right? It's like far from it. The same happens, like, I mean, you could think of it like a crime scene, right? Like the crime was committed, right? Someone hit the line or the seed with the line, and like you may not have a good recollection. The witness may give a testimony that isn't necessarily true because that's how they remember it. And it's the same way, like we're just focused on so many little things that are going on. So
they always think it's the demon hunters. It's always the demon hunters.
Well, they're flipping around and flying and doing that shit, so
fair.
They're up to something with it. Yeah. No, I mean,
definitely the level focus is relevant, right? To like you're trying to like do your job and play your spec, and I think that definitely hampers the recall.
Definitely, but the VODs, they show the truth. So at
They
least we have
do.
those. So I guess to summarize, the tip would be maybe that if you're raiding and you're trying to improve your skill, try to maybe record yourself or at least have shadow play available. That way, if something happens, you can just click that record button, maybe run it back, and just make sure that what you thought you saw was actually what happened. Because I know this also happens to me too. Like I might do something that's a mistake, and then I think I caused whatever it was, and then I'll watch the VOD and I'll be like, oh wait, there's something that's slightly different that happened there. I knew I made a mistake, so I assumed it was like my fault that the big thing went bad. But like, it's always good to like have that I guess check on yourself and also on your other members. So I mean, how do you get your guild to watch videos though? So like if you have content and you're like, all right, everyone show up, watch this video, this is the boss we're doing. How do you make sure that people actually get that done?
I mean, that's a topic that I'm still struggling with because I have a tendency to yap. So this is just kind of like the theory behind it is you want to pretend that everyone in your guild has ADHD and they are like 12 and they're like scrolling TikTok all day. So you wanna tailor any content you make to that demographic. So like 5 minutes max, and then it should just be like as the most relevant information possible. And ideally you like cater to like both extremes because there are people that will like watch a 30-minute video and digest it all and find it all like super useful and actually implement everything you say. But that's definitely not the majority pretty much anywhere. So that's just like something you want to be aware of. When it comes to like lower ranked guilds, something the strategy that I think is the best is actually taking up your raid time to watch a video together in short segments. So taking up raid time to not pull a boss really sucks. But the reality is in most guild, like people just won't do stuff outside of raid, right? So you can fix that by forcing them to do it in raid, and like take like the Dratnos like Parak video for example. Good example. You're just starting to pull Frack. Before you do that, watch until the first stream run, right? Mm-hmm. That's like 30 seconds or a minute or whatever. Like people are going to be able to pay attention for that long, right? You pull, you get it to that spot, and then ideally the raid leader has watched more so they can kind of like coach through if you happen to like get further, right? Yeah. But then after that, you've gotten further, then you watch the next segment, right? Then and you just kind of piece that together, and I think that is a pretty good strategy for lower rank guilds. But
is that kind of like predicting when the first set of wipes are going to start happening in the fight and just go up to that point?
Yeah, I think it's more of like a segment, like a time segmenting thing where like you just really want to balance that like relevancy versus like time spent watching.
Attention span, yeah.
So you want to show like the most relevant information and for the least amount of time.
So to summarize, it's basically try to cut up whatever you need to get eyeballs on to the correct size. Try not to stick too long with it. Maybe put up Subway Surfer next to it. That might keep people.
A little Minecraft speedrun or what's that car game?
Or like cutting
yeah.
You see like on TikTok where they're like cutting the foam, like the special foam. Stuff. Yeah, stuff like that. That might be good. And you bring up a good point here, right, with the raid time, because obviously if you're on limited hours, if you're only raiding X amount of days a week, you don't have all the time in the world. It does feel really bad, especially when you're trying to do splits and you're trying to get all this other stuff done. Like it feels really bad to slot in a little extra bit of not pulling the boss in there, but it definitely seems like it pays off in the long run, even if it may feel bad to do. It might feel counterintuitive, I guess, but
yeah, I think it really depends on the quality of guild as well. Like the segmenting like in raid like that I just mentioned is I think definitely like a lower end CE strategy. I think and it also kind of depends on like the hours you have in raid. Like if you're a 16-hour guild, then that doesn't feel as bad. But if you're at 9-hour guild, then that feels quite bad, right?
So, speaking of hours, what's the best way to get your group of people or potential guild on board for your raid schedule? I think this goes both ways too, shorter and longer.
Yes. The only benefit I see to raiding more, is to get like a higher rank. There's a few outliers of guilds full of people that just really like playing the game, and just vibe with a 16-hour schedule, like multiple raids during farm. They just like playing. They just like raiding. But that is definitely not, in my experience, the norm. Most people want to like clear the content.
Yeah, by the end of it, people just want out of there. They're just showing up because they feel obligated to show up.
Yeah, so during farm is like the showing up for farm raid and then logging off until next farm raid. And that's fine if that's like the general consensus of the guild, right? It becomes a problem no matter what your raid hours. Like, it's kind of like what I was saying before with like the guild identity and with velocity and stuff. It's like anytime that identity isn't like concrete across like the roster, it's going to be problematic no matter like what your raid hours are. Like even if you're just a 6-hour guild, but no one wants to log in, or like half the guild wants to log in and half the guild doesn't. Like, yeah, it's just always going to be a problem.
How do you decide on a time to raid, especially nowadays with like time zones being, we have people on the West Coast, we're on the East Coast. It's like obviously one chunk of time is better for one time zone. Other people, it's right in the middle of their dinner. I think this is, a problem that every type of guild deals with. Do you just kind of like take a vote, or what would be the process on that?
Yeah, well, most guilds are already like rating at certain hours, right? Just because they were like instantiated that way, and like the people that are going to join that guild are just going to make those raid hours or not.
Right.
With velocity, we just did a poll with the people that we had going into it, and then matched anyone that wanted to come in, or like, can you make these hours? And that was can you make these hours or not, right?
Yeah, you can't please everyone.
It's got to be sometime.
Yep, exactly.
So the ability to like identify strength and weaknesses on like an individual basis with players seems kind of important for someone who's running a guild or helping to run a guild. And not every guild obviously has like a full roster of fired ups, right? So like you don't it's not common to have like everyone can do whatever they need to do. So like what tips can you give to maybe other people who are working or running guilds, the best way to do this?
When it comes to player improvement, I think that it's just a very difficult topic because there's a lot of ego involved with like people's perception of their own skill and ability. There's a lot of bias that goes into like collective feeling in guilds about like certain players based off like certain events that may or may not have happened in the way that people perceive them to have. But the way I go about it, and the way I think is good, is to use the VOD foundation use the VOD platform as a foundation for any criticism that you do levy against anyone, right? It's like really hard to argue or be wrong about a clip that shows you making a mistake or doing something that was like incorrect, right? But a lot of guilds fall into the like, I feel like you did this, or I feel like you did bad tonight, or whatever. Or they're using like raid night death statistics and Warcraft logs, which is like kind of not great.
I guess it's probably pretty important early on to like establish, going back to the guild culture, like a certain way of doing criticism, because obviously when you're doing something that's hard, you need to be able to talk to each other and tell each other where you're making mistakes or where you could improve everyone's job, right? But you also inevitably will run into feelings, like you said. So I guess it's important to like set it in stone, like, here is how we do this, right? It's not start screaming in Discord at this person. It's, it's maybe we have a different channel for this. Or maybe it's happening after the raid too, right? Because some people will tilt. It's it's one of those things where like if you get on someone's case, sometimes it feels like certain people, they'll maybe fold a bit. They won't speak up anymore, and maybe you're just like down the man for the rest of the night. So I think, and this is something I kind of experienced too, like back when I was doing more responsible things with guilding, doing raiding. But yeah, it's a tough topic for sure. But I think another thing too is just like the difference in culture. So like I've been playing on EU for the last year. I played all of Dragonflight there, and I noticed it's just like way different when it comes to people making mistakes. It seems like people are just like way more likely to just kind of like pipe up right away and just like start scolding each other or flaming each other. And it's just banter, right? Like it's not actually, people aren't actually like getting upset about it. But to me, like with my American ear, I'm like, holy, they're going crazy on each other. Like, what's happening? Do these guys even like each other? That's crazy. But then I come back,
very
and
open culture about that, right?
Yeah, it's very different. So I guess with this advice, like you also have to factor in like where you're rating and what the guild culture is in general, because probably there's like a big difference, right, within guilds, like how they approach calling out mistakes.
There has to be accountability. Because
Yeah, there
accountability
does.
is like the biggest motivator to not screw up. If you know that like you can just fuck up every night and no one's gonna say anything, it's just not gonna work. There needs to be that fear.
You kind of have to know the Eye of Sauron's on you, you know?
Yeah.
Or else you're
There's
gonna
there's a massive like spectrum of it, right? Because there's a lot of guilds that like posting a clip of like what just caused the last wipe or like a death that was in like last wipe would be like very tilting. So or like it would make people feel like really bad. And then there's guilds where like everyone would love that, right? Because it's like, oh, so we just fix this for next pull and we're good.
Yeah.
Or like oh, I didn't have the time to get that myself, or I didn't realize, right? So that's awesome, right? So there's a very wide spectrum of reactions, and kind of like I was saying, like a wide spectrum of reasons that people play the game. And as anyone in leadership, you need to have assessed what the general like sentiment is from the people in your guild and what's going on there, right? And kind of manage your actions accordingly.
You know, whenever you're playing the game a lot, obviously everybody shows up for progression a little bit harder than they show for farm. World of Warcraft is a very seasonal game. We've got these big content droughts and then a bunch of content that just hits you in the face. So how do you keep a roster engaged, and how do you keep the passion for the game alive during those lulls?
Yeah, I have some theories about this. I talked with Bart, who's Pesker's GM, about it a fair bit as well. So not original ideas in some cases, but obviously Velocity hasn't gotten really to this point yet. Like,
I think people are pretty passionate across the board here.
Yeah, and that was pretty much the goal, right? Is to not have to deal with that too much. And partially that's because of me, right? Where like my my philosophy is like, if you can't be bothered to log in 1 day a week on farm and like show up and be like present and involved, then probably time to like set the game down, or like find somewhere else to raid
that matches
more,
that.
that's more seasonal, right? Like we
Yeah.
just don't do farm or something like that, or like some place where you'd fit in better, right? Because for off or better guild, it's not taking breaks isn't really a real thing that you can do, because it just alienates the people that do want to play, and then makes everyone who's not playing worse, right? Because like you do have to play the game to like maintain your skill level and all that. But in terms of like stuff you can implement in during farm to like get people more engaged, make it more fun for people, it really depends on like the players that you have. So something that like I think is fun is like setting up people for parsing, right? And rotating through people who want to parse like from week to week, because that's a large reason why some people play the game is like, I just want to do as much damage as possible or as much healing as possible, like bigger number, dopamine, whatever, right? So setting that up for them makes them really happy, right? And gives them that dopamine that they're looking for. It gives them the fun that they're looking for. Speed kills, kind of like tangential to that, can be fun and engaging for people. There's some dopamine involved, being like at the top of the speed ranking, or just like doing a cool kill on a boss. So like an idea for a Volcross speed kill, right, is like one tanking, one healing, and sending everyone to the same side. after the first soak, right? So that can be like fun and engaging, like 2 healing Tindril after like all the nerfs and going for a speed kill there can be engaging for people, because not only do you get to probably get a really good parse because you're doing like a lot of damage or a lot of healing, it'll just, depending on who's in your guild, it can feel kind of fun. Sales can be motivating for people if you're just breaking in the gold. A lot of people like that. Outside of that, it's really difficult.
Yeah.
And like you can always poll like your raiders, like what would you want to do, right? But the biggest problem with like the whole like farm idea is and like cycling through like they're doing different things and satisfying different people is like you really need it to be understood that you're not always going to be having fun, and that doesn't mean that you're never going to have fun. It's just that someone else is having fun, right? And kind of everyone needs to be okay with that idea that it can be someone else's turn, and that's okay. Your turn is like coming and stuff like that.
So in your situation, obviously, you know, offering speed kills and letting people parse is like an incentive for farm kills. But for somebody who is, you know, actively raiding in a CE guild or even an AOTC guild, in your opinion, how much do parses actually matter, and how much of an impact do outside sources like the raid's, you know, kill time or the strat that they're taking, how much do those have an impact on a player's personal parse?
There's like a floor of ability that you need to be able to get orange parses or purple parses or whatever, right? Yep. But pretty much anyone who can, depending on the spec, because it ranges depending on the spec. But if you can blue and purple parse, like you can pretty much get boosted to orange. It kind of depends, like pretty easily, depending also on like the bosses, because obviously it's gonna be harder on single target bosses to create that rank for people. But it's doable as long as you're like meeting the certain floor. I do not have a ton of respect for parses because I think that it's like the easiest part of the game, is to just be able to play your class to this floor, and then when you're getting into like the really competitive parses, you're either kind of cheating, or you're like being helped by your guild, or like there's something about the environments being manufactured to create this like really high ranking, right?
Yeah.
But that's not to be said that players that have those ranks don't have skill. It's just not particularly exceptional in most cases.
Right. So like if you're looking to recruit someone, you see good parses, how much does that factor in, I guess, to your wanting to recruit?
Yeah. So for me, it means very little, because it just doesn't tell me anything about how you approach progress or think about the game or like solve your own problems or anything. It tells me only that you can do throughput. Right. And there's like a negative connotation to it as well, where it's like entirely possible that you think too much about throughput and over like other things that you should be thinking about. Like for the vast majority of people who parse very well, they are not good progress players because they're only thinking about how to do as much damage as possible at all times. And that's like a very detrimental thing in most cases to progress. So,
and that's why those questions we were talking about earlier are so important when you're interviewing somebody, just to make sure that they know that there's more to a fight than just doing the most damage. You know, when are you using your defensives? Why are you using them? Why are you choosing to use this defensive for this mechanic rather than this defensive for that mechanic? There's like shit test questions that I think really give you more info than what a parse would.
Most of our interview is just, I really want to know how you think about the game, right? And how you like approach thinking about the game and solving the problems that you run into, because that's what differentiates players the most, for me, is how they can articulate those like answers to those questions.
Yeah, Telegon, I think your answer might surprise some of our listeners about not really having as much weight in the parses, because I know like it seems the general consensus out there for people who are trying to get recruited is just get the best logs possible. Do you think that's maybe because it's just like a really easy metric to just slap a number on someone and say they're this good.
Yeah, I mean there's a big dichotomy, right, between what's going to get you into a guild and then what actually means that you're a good or exceptional player, right? Like parses will get you into guilds, like very high end guilds, even in a lot of cases. Like the way most high end guilds recruit is they just recruit people with the best parses and they trial them and they judge from their play whether or not they're good. And then if they are bad, then they just kick them, right? Most guilds don't do any VOD review, or they don't look into like progress logs and see like how you were playing progress or what you were dying to on progress and stuff like that.
So there it is. Parses aren't the most important thing.
Yeah, it's settled. The debate is settled.
Well, I mean, it can work, right?
Yeah.
Like if your goal is like, okay, I want to get into like the highest like rank guild possible, the quickest, get on all stars, right?
Yeah.
Because that's going to get you into those conversations for sure. But don't forgo or devalue like the other aspects of player development if that's something you care about. Like if what you care about is being the best player you can, I guess.
So when I was like recruiting and sifting through like just a barrage of recruitment posts to try and figure out like who to get for like world first rating, to me it was more like the parse was like a check on a box that you had to like get in order for the next step to take place. So it wasn't necessarily like the parse would, get you in the guild, but it was like a necessary baseline. Like if you can do X amount of damage, like then you might be a good player, but then there's other filters to apply on top. So I guess it's still definitely important, right? But I think a lot of it comes down to just making sure that you're sifting out a good percentage of people because the guilds are operating like the high end. They have so many applications coming in, so they have to have like some way to filter out all the garbage, right, before they move on, or else they'd just be wasting all their time recruiting.
Yep.
So
and you can't you can't really filter it like that much from like a little note that they put next to it, right? Where it's
right. Or it'd be like time consuming to try and look for other things. So it's like the most, I think the reason why we have the parsing culture that we have in the high end in World of Warcraft is just because like there's not
the easiest
an easy
filter,
way.
right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like the path of least resistance, right?
Yeah,
so
no,
like
it's definitely the path of least resistance.
There's probably a larger amount of better players that have higher parses than
I think
good players who
statistically
have
speaking,
super low parses.
Yeah. Statistically speaking, I think there's a way higher chance that you're a good player if you do a good parse. It doesn't necessarily mean that, but
Definitely.
Like, if you had to just 50-50 it, right? You're going to go
even a
big
decent parse, right? Like if you have like a majority of purples, make maybe a couple blues, and then make maybe some orange, like a couple oranges, right? Like that's a player you should probably interview if they said something good in their application, right? About like jiving into the guild or something like that. Like it's so much easier to take that player and then ask them a couple of questions and immediately have an answer.
Yeah.
Then see that and be like, those questions aren't good enough.
So with somebody who might just be getting into reviewing logs and looking into their performance, what are like a few basic things that somebody could pull up and sort of assess what they could improve on? Are there specific things in a log that they could look at?
Yeah, kind of harkening back to the VOD review thing. We kind of touched on it a little bit, but outside of like the progress scenario of it, just recording yourself in dungeon content or like pug heroics or your raid and then watching that back, assuming that you have a good theoretical foundation of like how you should be playing your class, instantly reveals so many things that you're doing wrong, or like the small minutia of like, oh, I should have pressed this global instead, or I should have done I should have moved like this here, or I could have done this better. So like the totality of like player improvement, like it just comes always comes back to VODs, just because it's the most context rich media that possible. When it comes to logs, though, you can use that supplementally, or if you're not able to record your VODs, you can use that. And you should just start by making sure that your comparison is not whack. So
Right.
You shouldn't usually be comparing people with like wildly different gear or wildly different stats, or wildly different kill times. Although you can kind of get around the kill time thing a bit. And then make sure that they're running like the similar build, and that's like a thing that the first thing you can learn from logs is like going to the boss, like, is this the best build? Like, am I running the best talent setup for this?
Right.
Is there are there different builds that you could run under different circumstances? And then digging into these logs further, if you have yourself and you're able to compare, there's like 3 easy comparisons. One is just like the damage breakdown. Are the damage, like, are the percentages that each ability is doing like pretty much like the same? Going to the cast panel, are the cast per minutes like kind of like showing the priorities we have when we're both casting or pressing our buttons? Are those priorities pretty much the same? Going into the event timeline, for like cooldown windows, like do these look the same? If they and under all these like comparisons, right? It's like, okay, if they're not the same, why is that, right? Like, am I missing something? So you're kind of like going down these rabbit holes of figuring, like, of problem solving, right? So from a comparison standpoint, those are like the 3 things that I would look at the most quickly. If you haven't pulled the boss before, then you're just kind of like using their log as research, and you're just doing kind of the same thing without the comparison.
Another metric that I look at for myself, as a Havoc Demon Hunter, is my fury management, my resources, to see if I'm like wasting a bunch of fury, maybe like, tunneling too much into my builders because I'm trying to do a certain mechanic or whatever. So you can actually like go down to your resources and see how much was wasted compared to gained. I find that to be pretty useful as well. Yeah,
depending on what level you're at, like WoWAnalyzer can be a really good tool. Yep. To see stuff like that. They sometimes pull some really nice stats out of that. So I always tend to like check it out just for like whenever spec and see what it says, just to, like, out of curiosity.
There's also that site Lorrgs, where you can see where other logs are using their cooldowns, and you could like toggle it specifically to be like, okay, when are they using this trinket or this cooldown that my class has, and you can see it on the timeline. That can be pretty useful for a player as well.
I think Lorrgs is really interesting for healers specifically, especially with the function where you can just export their cooldowns as an ERT note for like the ERT raid note weakauras. For most healers, I imagine that should probably be the default, where you just take someone else's CDs and play around them. Not something you'd probably want to do at higher levels, but easy like plug and play probably works just fine for most people.
Yeah, it depends on some fights too, right? Like some fights will phase quicker if you put too much DPS into a boss in phase 1, and then everything gets thrown off. But it's definitely a good starting point.
I mean, there's a big caveat there, right? With healing being like a zero-sum game. And the top logs are going to be trying to do the most healing as possible, as much healing as possible, which isn't always the best.
Speaking of zero-sum game, the same applies to any fight with AoE, right? So like I just pulled up here a Tendril, and as you can see, like if you're doing this fight as devastation and you're like, why is my damage not too good? You can notice that like almost every single log that's doing well in this fight is holding their Dragon Rage to pad as much as possible on the roots. So like I guess there's like good information you can get here too that might inform you about how other people are addressing the fight if they're going just for damage. And if you're not just trying to parse, it can also give you kind of like peace of mind to know that like it isn't just you're making big mistakes. You're probably just not maximizing the AoE, because if your class
it's a really difficult situation to navigate, I think, on the whole, because straight up you will just not be rewarded for playing
the way you should,
as you should. on a boss like Tindral, like if you're a BM hunter on Tindral, and you're not playing AoE, like your parse will look horrible. Like you're gray parsing, and the amount of people that will look at that and be like, "Oh, you're bad," vastly outweighs the opposite. So,
or even if you're just on dragon duty, if you're one of the flyers, your parse is wrecked immediately. Like, there's no way that you can get a good parse.
Especially if you're like an unholy DK and you're getting sent up first. It's just over for you.
That's crazy. But yeah, and there's so many bosses like that with AoE and Amir Soul. But pretty much pretty consistently throughout this expansion. So
yeah, luckily when it comes to like all-star points and stuff, usually Warcraft logs filters out the bosses that are extra patty, but even if they do that, there's still like a lot of players who look at the number and just say like, "Oh, why aren't you doing as much damage as other people?" Or like someone asking themselves, "Why am I not doing this much damage?" And there's usually like a pretty good answer to it that may just be a little bit more than you're just bad, right? It could be one of the reasons, but there's probably other reasons too.
Yeah, I mean, I've been like had this internal joke that I say a lot where it's like bigger number, better player when it comes to like IO or parses or whatever, and I say it very like ironically, but a lot of people are very unironic about it.
Yeah.
I think it really just comes down to what people find fulfilling in the game, because everyone has like different motivations for playing. They may just want to have really good gear. They may want to just have an outlet to have fun with friends. They might want to parse. They might want to get world ranks. Like everyone's got like different goals in mind. And in my experience, people who aren't necessarily ranking too high, they usually like try to find an outlet to differentiate themselves from everyone else. So like I'll notice a lot of the guilds that aren't necessarily as high ranked, like they'll be really into parsing or like speed killing or something like that. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just like, I guess it really just comes back to the communication topic we were talking about before, like clearly stating the expectations for the guild and what you're signing up for, right? Because if you're joining a guild like this and you aren't really in the same mindset, you don't care about parsing as much, you're probably not going to have a good time. So I think for people who are looking for guilds, it's also important to get an idea, right? It goes both ways when it comes to that expectation.
Unfortunately, I think it's like super or pretty consistent across the community where like people in leadership don't like correctly value people who play for the team, especially when it comes to like minorities or people that like don't seem cool or whatever.
It's also like kind of a pitfall too, though, like in my experience. So one thing that's kind of annoying is typically if you do progression and you have a certain job that really costs you a lot of damage, it's, you know, it's fine. You just get it done. You do what's right for the guild. But a lot of guilds, not necessarily talking about our guild, but like other guilds I've been in the past, will do this thing where they don't want to change anything ever after they kill the boss once. So then it's like, if you volunteer for that job, you're not just volunteering for that pull or until you kill the boss, you're volunteering for like a whole year to do that job, because you're going to be basically stuck on duck duty or whatever it is until the next raid comes out, right? So I think it's really important too that like in guilds like this, that you you let that responsibility maybe float around a little bit, even if it may cause a wipe or two. So I'll give you a specific example, like for instance, doing this certain rescue in the fight, right? And then the timings for aug are different. So as an augmentation invoker, you're expected to just like do all the jobs, do all the little things, right? But then you swap specs, it actually matters that you have uptime now a lot more, but you know, you still have the same jobs you're gonna have to do. So I think it can be like a little daunting as a player to volunteer to do certain things if you feel like you're just gonna get stuck in it forever. You know what I mean? Like the communication there, I think, is also important, because it feels bad to just like do a job you hate every week over and over again when there's like better people for that job.
Yeah, it's definitely something you want to actively manage. That there is something you said for like the communication on the player's part. It was like, hey man, like, could I do some damage this week, please?
Right.
On council or whatever. But also I think it's like super valuable to make people learn stuff they haven't done before.
Right.
Just because people stagnate and they get used to, especially if they don't play high keys and they just kind of log into raid, do the same thing that they've done since prog or whatever, what have you. Like switching things up for people is like generally really beneficial, usually worth the wipes, and also like you have people have absences and stuff, right?
Right.
Always run the same kill comp every week. That like obviously something to be said for like your first rekill, like trying to make that go super smoothly, right? Your first sale,
Right.
trying to make that go super smoothly. But at the end of the day, having multiple people able to step up, do different jobs, that's just going to make your roster stronger, right? And that's something I think you kind of want to develop intentionally.
Yeah, I guess it just really comes down to the question of, how okay are people going to be if we wipe to the same way a couple times if everyone is just coming into raid log, right? So I think it really just comes down to how much people care about being in the game. Because if people just don't really want to play the game and they're going in hoping for one shots on every boss, and then you say you're changing a strat, you'll probably get a lot of people going ugh because they don't want to do that.
Yeah. I mean, it all comes down to the culture, right? Like,
Yeah.
like when I said earlier about like speed kills and parsing, right? Like if one guy wants to parse, right, and then everyone else wants to log out, and you're like wiping trying to get this guy to parse, like people are not going to be pleased. So it comes back to like analyzing the friction of the stuff that you think is you want to do, or stuff that you think is good, and determining whether it's worth doing after that.
So if someone's like brand new to logs and they're not looking at this from a guild leader perspective, they're looking at this more from the player perspective, and they're trying to improve, what would your first recommendation be to look at to see if they're performing well or where they can maybe improve as a player?
I would generally go to exactly what I said before with the damage breakdown, cast per minute priority. It's super easy to see, like if you're just not casting ability with the same priority, like you have 5 casts, this guy has 10. The cast per minute is obviously like a fight time independent statistic, right? So that makes it super clear as well. So you can kind of like see instantly, like if my damage breakdown just doesn't look like theirs, something is wrong. Something's not right. Yeah. And then if we're not casting the same spells with the same priority, then obviously something's wrong there.
I think another,
like Jedith said, the resource waste things can be pretty common as well.
I think another thing that's really important too, just for me, like personally, is if I die to something, I want to make note of what it is. And I may not add some alert or something to it right in the moment, but I will try to go back after the raid night and tally up every way that I died and try to figure out a game plan for if that happens again, if I'm in that exact scenario again, and use the power of weakauras, right, and add-ons and Plater and all that to like add alerts, bigwigs, all that good stuff, so that I never get caught off guard by it again. So like if I die to something once, it's like that's an air horn, right? It's stuff like that.
Having the ability to make like simple weakauras, or go into bigwigs and add alerts to things, like just the sound countdown or change the color of a bar. Just those 3 things, just being able to make a bigwigs based weakaura where like 5 seconds before this thing it pops up in the middle of my screen, tells me to do something, or it has a text to speech message play when it shows to say something, or it plays an air horn or whatever. Those 3 things can take you from like honestly like a terrible player to like a decent player like instantly. If every time you encounter something that you don't like, that causes you to make a mistake, right, like unforced error, we'll call it, like you stand in a frontal or something like that, if you just add a queue to it, it will be like almost impossible to
make
die to it again. Right? Yeah. Which is like the biggest differentiator between like a bad player and like a okay player, right? Is like a bad player dies to the same thing over and over, and like decent player dies to it once or twice. Extend that to like learning stuff about your class, right? Like if you're a Recidruid and you're learning to like F-low, for instance, like you need to keep your F-low down, like just having that basic ability to go into weakauras, like your F-low is not down, it's like glowing on your screen, it's like bouncing, right? It's like trying to draw your attention to it. If it's expiring, right, it like makes a sound, and like rotating through those things like as you learn, generally just across WoW. If you identify like one problem at a time, right, and you implement a solution and you just play with that solution, right, and then you just cycle, just like create a cycle where you're always doing that, you'll eventually get somewhere good.
I think having the skill to make weakauras is such a good asset to have, even if it's just basic things like just knowing how to like set up an alert for a mechanic or something, or even just going into bigwigs and doing it. I've encountered a lot of people actually that have no clue. They don't even know how to make there's templates in the
well, the
WeakAuras.
best, yeah, exactly. You don't need to know how to do it. You just need to find something similar and then literally copy paste.
Change it.
Yeah, I think that's a good tip for people. I want to touch more on the sound cue thing. I think that's so good because I think you need to have a system if you're going to be a good player. Not everyone plays with game sounds on, but if you do, it can be an advantage to try and pair the sound with what's happening. So if there's an interrupt I need to get, it's always a telephone ring. If there's a frontal, it's like a gong. If there's a one-shot mechanic, it might be an air horn, right? But just like pairing very specific sounds, and it might just seem nonsensical to you, right, that these are matched up, but just find something that works for you. Not everyone needs to have the same system, but I think just having it be consistent can help you react a lot better. Because even if you forget what's happening, if I hear the telephone, I'm like, oh, I'm supposed to be interrupting something. Where's my interrupt, right? That kind of click in your brain. It's like training dogs, right? Like with the Pavlov's bell thing. Like I hear the ding ding ding. Oh, okay, I need to interrupt, right? So
I have another analogy.
Okay.
If you just think like if anyone just thinks about WoW as like a skill or like a sport, and you think of what works when you're learning a skill or you're learning a sport, like when it comes to like the idea of drills, right? Or like the deliberate practice where you're like isolating something and then like
repeating it,
developing that muscle memory or like the instinct, right, to do it. If you just like think about the real world scenarios, it becomes like super obvious, at least to me, what you should do in game, right? Like for example, like in tennis, like you're trying to like learn your swing, right? And like there's a certain grip you want, right? So you take some duct tape and you tape your hand on the racket in the correct position, right? And you can do the same thing in WoW with WeakAuras and like what you're seeing on your screen and the sound cues and the visual cues. And it's just such a hack, and it's not like super inaccessible. So there's just so much you can take advantage of there, instead of like raw dogging it.
We have a question from chat. So Hyperion asks, have they talked about tanks trying to find new guilds? So I guess what would be your best advice for someone who's looking for a new guild who happens to be a tank?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the more difficult dynamics to manage. The tank position is very difficult because you need them to raid. So those positions are usually like really solid, and if they're not, as long as they have someone that is like not terrible that shows up every week and is okay, generally people will just stick with that
because it's hard to replace.
Because it's really hard to replace, because the trialing process for tanks is intensely difficult. Because during farm, tanking becomes exceedingly trivial when it comes to staying alive. Generally in this expansion, living has been pretty deprioritized as difficulty that tanks really experience outside of the Race to World First, and even in it, to be honest. And that so like what you're kind of left with is positioning and how quickly you learn fights, and how consistently you execute the mechanics and the boss movement. And then like the further step is like thinking about solving problems that come up that are like specific to something like the tank can do that no one else can really do, right? So like an example of that is like the Dream Rend.
Right.
Melee, I make this comparison a lot with like melee being sheep. Like they're just going to stand on the back of the boss and hit the boss, and that's all they're going to do, and they're not going to move no matter what. Then they'll just stand. If you put the boss in the orbs, then they'll just sit there and get run over. So that the tank can more aggressively move the boss and keep everyone safe.
Jedith, can you confirm?
I've never been hit by an orb. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yep, never been hit by an orb before.
Never.
Yeah. But all those things are very difficult qualities to assess in a trial period, especially if that tank has pulled the boss before. Generally, tank spots are open because like there's a lot of friction with that spot with like not being good or like not.
It's a huge wipe driver.
Yeah. So generally there's at least in the lower to mid CE range, there's a decent amount of like open tank spots, but it's really like you gotta like come in and then be like very consistent, and then you really kind of have to impress out of the gate, right? because like on farm, like people just want it to go smoothly. I mean,
Yeah.
pretty much no one wants to tank wipe ever. That very, very frustrating for everyone. So it's just very difficult. And then like even if you perform okay during prog, especially like you've pulled the boss before, then you just do the same thing you've always done. It's fine. Like the stuff that matters on prog doesn't really matter during farm. You didn't frontal the ads, so we're all good. And then you get the prog, and then that guy's just floor POV and doesn't learn quickly, and you're waiting for him to learn.
It feels like you're in hell when you have a bad tank.
Yeah,
and like
it's difficult to manage,
and that's what's keeping you back. I think it's also really important to have the quality in the tank that you're trying to recruit where they aren't going to argue a lot about changes, because I've had this experience before, not anyone specific, but just like a tank that just seems like very negative. So you'll tell them to do something and they'll say, no, I can't, that's impossible, I can't do that, right? And or you'll make a recommendation, ask for something to be changed, and they'll be very resistant to any sort of modifications to what you're doing. And I think that it's really hard as like a raider in the guild where someone's being like this to like keep the morale up. I think it's like the best way to kill your guild's morale is just to be very negative about if you can do something as a tank or not. I feel like they almost have to gaslight themselves into just thinking that they're Superman, because it should be obvious if you can't do something after you try to do it a certain way, but you should be open to trying it. I think
that's the worst role for that, that
Yeah,
personality type or whatever is going on there to be coming out.
It's miserable when you have a tank with a bad attitude. Like I don't tank, so I can't really criticize too much, but I just as a player who's been in that situation, it feels like hell on earth.
Yeah, I think you really have to accept the severity and the dynamic of the role that you're in. Because like when it comes to being a tank in the progression guild, where you're trying to get a CE or like a decent rank, it's like your job is to learn the fight before anyone else, right? You have like the steepest learning curve. To like from pull 1, like all the movement should be correct or as correct as possible, right? Like you should not be dying. All the movement should be as good as possible. And this level of like learning curve is like far higher than DPS or healer to go in there and just do it right? And the reason for that is because it's not usually exceedingly difficult. It's just very exacting, right? Like in phase 1 frac, like I need the boss to be exactly where it should be throughout the whole phase, and that just needs to happen. I need you to be thinking like during progress about how to help like the melee do their jobs. So like if it comes to Firestorm, like how can you position the boss to make life more easy for them? Just like throughout for every boss, like are you positioning the boss to make like melee's life easier or make whatever mechanic easier? It's just very, very difficult, and those things are very like high cost if you fail, right? Like if like if you move the boss weird, the whole raid is going to be like, what the heck's going on? And someone's going to make a mistake, right? Because it's weird, and
It's like
it wasn't what they were used to, right? So it's you can like very small stuff that wouldn't matter in other roles, like matters a ton as a tank. So that's it, you just kind of have to accept like this heightened level of dependence,
and also criticism.
And criticism. And you really have to like envision yourself as like the guy who shows up knowing exactly what to do, a guy or girl, shows up knowing exactly what to do, is able to learn very quickly and do like perform like their role consistently, and then is like actively looking to help the raid in however they can, right? Because like so you're like in this kind of like leadership role and also a support role at the same time. I think that maybe that is what causes a lot of difficulty for people.
And I think on top of that, you're also in a role that I think most players would agree isn't as satisfying as some of the the others too. At least,
for sure,
yeah,
in certain cases, right?
I feel like fulfilling
kind of
those things that I mentioned in prog can be really fulfilling, but it definitely is difficult to be noticed, right? Because when you're doing it super well, everything just works, right? But when you're not, it's not always super obvious that it's your fault. or like it's a tank thing. So definitely really difficult to be noticed and appreciated for like really high quality tank play for sure.
Yeah, when the position isn't consistent, it's like the grand design of whatever your strat is, it's like the puzzle, right? And the puzzle piece isn't gonna fit, and everything else is gonna be off after that, and it just to me, it's if I get like very specific whenever I play the fight, like I try to learn every bit about my rotation and my positioning in the exact spots that I do it, and I try to always repeat the same thing over and over again. So whenever it's like a little bit off, you definitely feel that
when your rotation involves moving, like fell rushing every 6 seconds. You know,
exactly.
It's very important.
especially as a melee and especially as a Voker because of the range thing. So you very generally like set up the range pile exactly at 25 yards. So if you're just like a little bit off, it's very obvious, right? Because you can't hit the boss anymore. So yeah, it really just feel like a weird spot for tanking right now in the current meta of World of Warcraft because we have this job that's very intense and it's very scrutinized, and you have to pretty much show up and do everything perfectly to like be a baseline tank, right? But then also, where's the incentive to do it? It feels like it's more of an obligation for a lot of people. And I know there's a ton of people out here listening to this who are tanking right now who don't want to be tanking. They want to get the hell off the roll, but they can't find anyone else to do it, right? So it's like, what do? You threaten to leave the guild? Like, what are you going to do? So I feel like it's another one of those things where you can actually get locked into the position and then you're dissatisfied. And I think that can manifest in the negative attitude. So I don't know what the solution is, but I feel like
the right solution
now,
is vengeance.
Yeah, I think solution. Yeah, I think vengeance is the solution because I was about to say I feel like tanks were more. They enjoyed tanking more when they were doing more damage. So it
should be
cool.
Like both tanks and healers should just do 70% of a DPS. I don't know why we hate that idea, but
they should also do that just to buff aggro. That sounds good to me.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
We're gonna bring that up every podcast episode until it gets fixed.
Actually, no, they're fixing the war then, so we're good.
Okay.
But yeah,
I have a short story, bro. I'm doing like 1.2 million DPS or something in the first pull of Algathar Academy, right? And I get ripped off by a warlock doing 8 mil. Like, middle of the pack, ripped off. Like that is crazy.
It does feel like it's a little off right now. I know there's a reason for why they changed a bunch of stuff with threat, like, you know, and they added fervents. They want to eliminate people just kiting to do keys, but I don't know. The solution just seems a little off to me. It just seems like it's maybe toned down a little bit more than it should be.
I don't know. I just feel like they never should have changed the Legion threat modifier. I feel like it was okay then.
Yeah, we didn't even mention Mythic Plus for tanking. Oh my god, that's a whole other that's a whole other
that is far worse.
Dude, you have to know the route, you have to know
the
count, you have to do all the stops, you have to, like, so much. You are literally carrying the group on your back. Like, there's actually so much going into it. So to me it's like you have to be insane to play a tank because it's just like there's so much going
just
into
expect so much of you. Like the route, okay. I mean, you're the one pulling it, so it kind of makes sense, right? But then it's like, okay, I did the extra effort. I got the route for you guys, and I like have done all the research on like how to pull the dungeon. But now also, okay, can you like call stops and, you know, like figure everything else out for us? Like also, like you're the IGL too, right?
I think it also goes both ways though, because as a tank, you also have a lot more control over whether or not you succeed in the key, and that's something that's a bit frustrating to deal with sometimes as a DPS. Is it can feel a little bit like you're kind of just
at the mercy.
Ride.
Yeah,
you're kind of at the mercy of like other people doing the job they need to do.
It's a really crazy NA thing where I believe this is maybe you have a different experience, but no one but tanks is expected to call in NA. And like you look at Echo and Gingy's the one calling, right? Or Stove is the one calling, and it's like these DPS are just these range DPS are just like chilling in range, bro, just like blasting away, and they're just
payphoning, man.
Yeah, they're just payphoning it in, and your tank's like like sweating, like that meme, right? Like like the speedrunner meme where he's just like drenched in sweat, like tanking like 20 mobs. He's like trying to call every stop while dying, and
you know what?
It feels really unfair.
It's Blizzard's fault for adding like 9 million stops to Demon Hunter tank, so I feel like that might be
and I think it's Blizzard's fault for adding so many spells to the mobs, bro.
Yeah, dude. Every mob is
like Legion dungeons did not feel like this, man. I just pulled and it was like, okay, we gotta stab this one spell, and then we're good.
So we've yapped a little bit about tanking, but I think that was good conversation. I want to ask you more, getting back to the guild side of things. What's your favorite thing about running a guild?
I like really, I like as a person, am really someone who gets a lot of satisfaction from doing things with other people. So when it comes to like games in general, like I don't play games by myself. I'm always doing it in other people and like cooperative content. That's kind of like the most that I get out of it. Is I just want to try and the thing that I want is to try and get as close to Pescaris as possible when it comes to like the efficiency we're able to create, while also having that like living up to, I guess, the identity that we espouse. So it's really just like those two things. A lot of people ask in like the interview, like if we have like a ranking goal, and I have like a numbers that I say, but what I say after that is like what I really want is at the end of the tier, I just want to be satisfied with the quality of play and like how we work together as a team to like to progress the raid.
I think a lot of guild masters would probably think it but not say it. They also like to not calling anyone out, but I think this is like a meme, right? It's like, oh, I like to guild the loot. Just get myself.
Dude, I have not given myself a single piece of loot, and I feel like I should.
Yeah, I think it either goes one way or the other, right? It's like either you are like afraid to give yourself loot because you're trying to be like the best, oh, look at me, I'm not giving myself loot. And then it's like you also have the flip side where it's like something finally snaps and you're like, you know what? Give me that item right now. Just give it to me. We're not even rolling, dude. Just hand it over.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm in like a really weird spot where like I want to make sure everyone else gets like the playtime they want and the items they want. And I'm like not really prioritizing like slotting myself in, and I'm doing like the outside of raid leading and stuff. But I definitely still want gear, so maybe
everyone does, man. That's why
maybe
we're
I'll
playing
flip.
the game.
I think I gotta flip it up and once I'm back from my trip and give myself some loot.
The glizzy gobbler, just show up and start gobbling up the loot.
Yeah.
Do you think loot becomes less of a motivator in higher ranking guilds, or is it always just kind of a fun thing that kind of pushes everyone to keep going?
I think it can depend. The thing that you see the most in higher end guilds is that people want to do content outside of raid Mythic Plus. And those people care about loot because it enables them to better do that content. One of the things that I really wanted when I thought about this for Velocity was like, I do not want a single message after I've assigned loot about like, I wanted that, or you should have given this to this person. I just want it. I want this understanding that like when I'm awarding loot, I'm doing it with like the best intentions possible for the raid group. Like in a progress scenario, right? Like I have like everyone's drop optimizer. I know like the relative damage number, and like whatever decision I'm making, I'm like doing it with like progress in mind. And that should just kind of be like the end of it. And pretty much everyone is on board with that, which is really nice. But then like during farm, I'm gonna prio people that like want to play the game in Mythic Plus for loot that like better enables them to do that. So that's pretty like understood, and I like that. And it's pretty similar in Liquid. Like obviously like, getting loot feels good, and then needing loot to like do Mythic Plus is like a dynamic that exists. So yeah, but it should never be like a source of drama. Like it's not that important at the end of the day.
Can you expand a little bit more on that tool you were describing? So this is what WowAudit? Is this the one?
Yeah, so WowAudit is a very it is classically just a spreadsheet that tracks like the item level of people in your guild, the tiers, the tier that they have, the amount of Mythic Plus dungeons they've ran. That's like the primary use, and a lot of guilds have used it for that. But they've expanded into like an entire website that has a lot of interesting features. And I'm giving like a free plug, which is fine because I like the drop optimizer tool a lot. So basically, everyone can put in their drop optimizer for whatever raid at like max upgrades or or whatever like settings you've configured or whatever like sim you want them to do, like 5-minute single target or anything. And it'll show the either percentage or raw DPS gain from receiving like whatever item, and it's like segmented by boss for whatever raid.
Right.
So super easy way to see like, well, what character is this the highest throughput upgrade on? Where it really makes it really easy to answer that question.
Yeah, I think we in Velocity go above and beyond what I think a normal guild does when it comes to loot, and I think that's a good thing because it definitely helps to feel like you can trust where the loot's going. I think typically when it comes to like loot drama, I don't think it ever like really spurs for like from like one thing. I feel like it generally happens over time. It's like you start noticing things, and then maybe there's a situation where, you know, one person just keeps getting the loot that you're trying to get, or maybe you go a whole 2 weeks or 3 weeks without getting a piece of loot. I think that people's distrust and also their frustrations, it's always like a ongoing process, and it takes a while for them to kind of boil over. With a few exceptions, like there's some people out there who are just loot goblins, right? And they'll just like freak out if they don't get like the first item. But I think for most reasonable people, like the average, right, it definitely is something that boils over. And I think a lot of that is about the process. Like people understand the process, right? Like if I know what sort of metrics you're using, if I have this visibility, right, like where I can see, you know, oh, here's where everyone's upgrades are, right? Like this clarity that WowAudit gives you, where you can see everyone else's parses too. I think it's really nice because you can almost like brace for impact. So if there's an item you're really gunning for, and you like go look up that item and you see that you're just like not as big of an upgrade as other people for the item, I think it's a little bit easier to go into the raid and get looked over and then not be mad about it, right? Because you know going in like, oh, okay, so we have some people who really need this. And actually, like, even though it's a really big upgrade for me, it's my biggest upgrade, it's not quite where other people are at. So I think that this tool is great for a lot of reasons, but also just because it may just help people kind of hash it out a little bit when it comes to their feelings about loot as well.
Yeah, I really like the transparency, and I think that when you just have like one guy assigning it or like a loot council assigning it, like you get a bias, right, where like the best player gets like so much loot, or like certain officer gets like a ton of loot, and people notice that stuff, right? So
yeah. But I think on the flip side, like in a lot of guilds, it's actually really important to gear up the players who are your quote unquote best
generally
players,
performing
right?
the best.
Yeah, because if you've got like a guild where let's say you have like 5 core players who are like really good, and they could probably raid in a much better guild, and then the rest of the guild kind of just like doesn't really do much, just kind of raid logs and doesn't really play the game otherwise and doesn't care about their performance. I think you get more out of the item if you give it to the person who can actually perform. So you know, as someone in the past who has benefited from getting more loot because I do more damage, like I think it's also important to consider that maybe people are getting loot too just because they show up and they have more passion about it and they care a lot more about their performance.
There's a lot of like valid ways to do loot, like making sure that whatever that reasoning is like good for the environment that you're in.
Right.
And if they got Grief Torch, that probably means that they're the person that dies the least. It's just the truth.
Giving dude, I've heard a lot of drama about like guilds giving Grief Torch to their tanks or not giving Grief Torch to their tanks when it's like the best upgrade for them.
In this season, everyone has like so much access to loot though, so I feel like it's a little bit
this season's like, why would you ever be mad about loot?
Right, exactly. It'd be exactly, unless it's like just completely wasting the loot.
Yeah,
but it definitely causes more friction when you don't have the bullion vendor, right? And you see a rare drop, and you're like, "Oh my god, we're never going to see this one again," right? So we gotta get my hands on it.
Yeah, the thing that I thought about a lot was like, okay, so we're going to next tier. We're raiding 9 hours a week, right? We have 2 heroics plus to do, and then as much mythic as we can get our hands on, right? In that environment, you cannot take too much time to do loot, right? You need to make the best decision you can, like between the boss, and then everyone just has to like live with that and understand that's just the best for your week, right? But in other guilds, that's not necessarily the case. So,
all right. Well, I think on that note, we are going to start wrapping it up. It's been a great opportunity to talk to Telegon, and it's been nice to sort of take a more targeted approach to our topic this week. I hope you guys enjoyed listening to us talk about this, and I hope you learned a thing or two. And if you are in a guild, hopefully maybe you understand the inner workings of it a bit better. If you're a guild leader, maybe you learned something. And if you're a raider who's been slacking off, maybe you're going to stop slacking off now. Telegon, if you just want to say anything else to the viewers, or if you want to plug anything, feel free to go ahead.
I'm good.
Hold on, Telegon, where can we follow you?
You can follow me on Twitch or Twitter. Just Liquid Telegon.
What's your... Okay, Liquid Telegon. There it is.
And then Telegon MVP on Twitch. That's it.
There it is. There it is.
And everyone should apply to his guild, even if you don't think you're qualified. Just bombard him with applications.
please don't do that.
I need another 173. Oh boy.
And one last reminder, the podcast is on Spotify now, so if you're not able to catch it on YouTube, you can catch it on Spotify. All the previous episodes have been uploaded too, so you have a listening catalog to go through. All right, guys, thank you so much for listening and watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Bye.